Eleanor Mitchell sat on the edge of her small bed, staring at yet another letter that had arrived that morning. The words on the paper seemed to blur together, but she knew what they said without reading them again. "Thank you for your interest, but we have found a more suitable match." It was the same message she had received 15 times in the past 6 months. At 32 years old, Eleanor was considered an old maid by everyone in Boston. The neighbors whispered about her whenever she walked to the market. The young women at church looked at her with pity, while their mothers shook their heads and made comments about how she had waited too long. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it in a wooden box with all the others. Each rejection felt like a small knife cutting into her heart. She had tried everything. She had posted advertisements in 3 different newspapers. She had asked friends to introduce her to their single male relatives. She had even attended social gatherings where she felt completely out of place among girls half her age. The truth was, Eleanor had not chosen to wait this long. When she was 22, she had been engaged to a kind man named Thomas. They had planned a spring wedding, but Thomas had died in a factory accident just 2 months before they were supposed to marry. Eleanor had been so heartbroken that she could not even think about other men for years. By the time she felt ready to love again, she was 28. In Boston society, 28 was already considered quite old for a first marriage. Most women her age were already married with several children. The few single men who remained were either much older widowers looking for someone to care for their children, or young men who wanted wives barely out of their teenage years. Eleanor walked to the small mirror hanging on her wall and looked at herself honestly. She was not a beauty, but she was not ugly either. Her brown hair was still thick and shiny, though she had noticed a few gray strands recently. Her face had some lines around her eyes, but they came from smiling and reading, not from hardship. Her figure was fuller than it had been at 20, but she was still healthy and strong. The problem was not really how she looked. The problem was her age and her situation. When her father had died last year, he had left behind more debts than money. Eleanor had been forced to sell their house and move into a tiny apartment in a poor part of the city. She worked as a seamstress to pay for food and rent, but the work was hard on her eyes and fingers, and it barely provided enough money to survive. She knew she needed to find a husband soon, not just for companionship but for basic survival. A woman alone had very few options in 1887. She could continue working as a seamstress until her eyesight failed, or she could try to find work as a governess or companion to a wealthy family. But both of those options meant a life of servitude with no family of her own. Eleanor sat down at her small table and pulled out a newspaper that her neighbor had given her. The neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was a kind Chinese woman who had also struggled to find acceptance in Boston society. Mrs. Chen had pointed to a particular section of the paper before giving it to Eleanor. "Look here," Mrs. Chen had said in her careful English. "Many men in the West need wives. They do not care so much about age. They care about good women who can work hard and be loyal." Eleanor found the section Mrs. Chen had mentioned. It was filled with advertisements from men seeking mail-order brides. Some of the ads were clearly from men looking for young, pretty women, but others seemed more practical, asking for women who could cook, clean, and help with farm work. One advertisement caught her attention. It was from a man named Samuel Crawford who lived on a cattle ranch in Montana Territory. His ad was different from the others. Instead of asking for a young, beautiful woman, he had written, "Seeking a mature woman of good character for marriage. Must be willing to work hard and face the challenges of ranch life. Age less important than strength of spirit. Serious inquiries only." Eleanor read the ad 3 times. The word mature stood out to her. Most men would never use that word in an advertisement for a wife. It gave her a small spark of hope. She spent the next hour reading other ads, but none of them seemed as promising as Samuel Crawford's. Some men were clearly looking for servants rather than wives. Others seemed to want very young women who could give them many children. A few ads were so poorly written that Eleanor doubted the men could even read or write properly. That evening, Eleanor sat down to write a letter to Samuel Crawford. She started and stopped several times, not sure what to say. How could she present herself honestly without scaring him away? How could she explain her situation without sounding desperate? Finally, she decided to focus on her strengths. She wrote about her experience managing her father's household after her mother died. She mentioned her skills in cooking, sewing, and managing money. She talked about her love of reading and her knowledge of basic medicine, which she had learned from helping her father, who had been a doctor. When it came to her age, Eleanor hesitated. She knew that even a man who said age was not important might change his mind when he learned she was 32. After thinking for a long time, she decided to describe herself as past the bloom of youth but still healthy and capable of bearing children. Eleanor also faced another problem. Samuel Crawford had asked for a photograph, but Eleanor had not had a professional photograph taken in years. The only recent pictures she had were unflattering ones taken at church events. Then she remembered the beautiful photograph her mother had taken when she was young. In that picture, her mother looked radiant and full of life. Eleanor had always been told she looked very much like her mother. After much internal debate, Eleanor decided to include her mother's photograph instead of her own. She told herself it was not really lying since people always said they looked alike. She convinced herself that Samuel would be more interested in her character than her exact appearance. The next morning, Eleanor took her letter and the photograph to the post office. As she handed them to the postal clerk, her hands were shaking slightly. She was taking an enormous risk. She was potentially giving up everything she knew for a man she had never met in a place she had never seen. Walking home from the post office, Eleanor passed a group of women from her church. She heard one of them say, "Poor Eleanor Mitchell, 32 years old and still hoping to find a husband. Someone should tell her that ship has sailed." Eleanor kept walking, but the words stung. Maybe those women were right. Maybe she was foolish to think that any man would want her at her age. But as she climbed the stairs to her small apartment, she decided that she would rather take a chance on an unknown future than accept a life of loneliness and poverty in Boston. That night, Eleanor lay in bed imagining what Montana Territory might be like. She had heard it was wild and dangerous with harsh winters and endless open spaces, but she also imagined it as a place where a woman might be valued for her strength and character, rather than her age or social connections. 3 weeks later, Eleanor received a reply from Samuel Crawford. His letter was brief but encouraging. He thanked her for her honest description of herself and invited her to come to Montana Territory to meet him. He had enclosed money for her train ticket and promised to meet her at the station in Copper Creek. Eleanor held the letter and the money, knowing that her life was about to change forever. She was terrified, but for the first time in years she also felt hopeful. Eleanor Mitchell packed her few belongings into a single worn leather suitcase that had belonged to her father. Everything she owned in the world fit into that one bag. Her good dress, her mother's jewelry, her father's medical books, and a few personal items that held precious memories. As she prepared to leave Boston, her sister Catherine came to see her off. Catherine was 5 years younger than Eleanor and had married at 19 to a successful banker. She had 3 children and lived in a beautiful house in the best part of the city. "Eleanor, this is madness," Catherine said, pacing around the tiny apartment. "You are going to live with a complete stranger in the middle of nowhere. What if he is cruel? What if he is a drunk? What if he already has a wife hidden somewhere?" Eleanor folded her winter coat carefully. "What if he is kind and lonely just like I am? What if this is my chance to have the family I have always wanted?" Catherine shook her head. "You could come live with us. Richard has said you could help with the children and the household. You would be safe and comfortable." Eleanor had considered this option many times, but she knew what her life would be like in her sister's house. She would be the spinster aunt, helping to raise other people's children while having none of her own. She would be grateful for every meal and every small kindness, never truly belonging anywhere. "I need to try this, Catherine," Eleanor said softly. "I need to know if there is still a chance for me to have my own life." The train station was crowded and noisy. Eleanor had never traveled anywhere alone before. The train to Montana Territory would take 4 days, with stops in several cities along the way. She had enough money for food during the journey, but she would have to be careful not to spend too much. Eleanor found her seat in the third-class car. The seats were hard wooden benches, and the car was crowded with families. Single men heading west to find work, and a few other women who looked like they might also be mail-order brides. As the train pulled away from Boston, Eleanor watched the familiar buildings disappear. She felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She was leaving everything she knew, but she was also leaving behind years of rejection and disappointment. The woman sitting across from Eleanor was about her own age, with graying hair and worn clothes. After a few hours, the woman introduced herself as Mrs. Dorothy Walsh. She was traveling to Colorado to keep house for her brother after his wife died. "And what takes you west, dear?" Mrs. Walsh asked kindly. Eleanor hesitated. She was embarrassed to admit she was a mail-order bride. "I am going to Montana Territory to meet a gentleman," Mrs. Walsh nodded knowingly. "Ah, I see. Well, there is no shame in it, dear. A woman must do what she must do to survive in this world." As the train traveled west, Eleanor met other passengers. There was a young couple with 2 small children who were moving to Kansas to start a farm. There was an older man who had lost his farm in Ohio and was hoping to find work in the silver mines of Colorado. And there were 3 other women who were clearly mail-order brides, though they were all much younger than Eleanor. The youngest of these women was named Betty, and she could not have been more than 18 years old. She was traveling to meet a rancher in Wyoming. Betty was pretty and cheerful, and she chattered constantly about her excitement. "I just know he is going to be handsome and romantic," Betty said to anyone who would listen. "He wrote that he has a big house and many cattle. I am going to have the most wonderful life." Eleanor listened to Betty's enthusiasm with mixed feelings. She envied the girl's confidence and optimism, but she also worried that Betty had unrealistic expectations about what life as a rancher's wife would be like. On the second day of the journey, Eleanor overheard a conversation that made her stomach turn. 2 middle-aged men were talking loudly about the women in their car. "Look at that old one over there," one man said, pointing in Eleanor's direction. "Can you imagine being so desperate that you would answer an advertisement from a complete stranger?" "She must be at least 30. The other man laughed. "These old maids heading west are just pathetic." "Any man who would want one of them must be pretty desperate himself." Eleanor felt her face burn with shame. She stared out the window and pretended not to hear, but their words cut deep. She began to wonder if Samuel Crawford was indeed desperate. Maybe he was old and sick or cruel, or had some terrible secret that made him unable to find a wife locally. That night, as the train rocked back and forth through the darkness, Eleanor could not sleep. She kept thinking about the men's cruel words. She thought about turning around at the next big city and going back to Boston. But then she remembered her empty apartment and her dwindling savings. She had already burned her bridges. There was no going back. On the 3rd day, the landscape began to change dramatically. The green hills and forests of the east gave way to vast open plains. Eleanor had never seen so much empty space. The sky seemed bigger than it had ever been in Boston, and she could see for miles in every direction. Some of the passengers were frightened by the emptiness, but Eleanor found it strangely comforting. Out here, it seemed like a person could start fresh. Past mistakes and failures might not matter so much in a place where everyone was struggling to build new lives. Betty, however, was becoming less cheerful as they traveled further west. The towns they passed were smaller and rougher than what she had expected. Instead of the romantic frontier towns she had imagined, she saw dusty streets, simple wooden buildings, and men who looked like they had not shaved or bathed in weeks. "This is not what I thought it would be like," Betty confided to Eleanor. "Everything looks so rough." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. "Life in the West is probably very different from what we are used to in the East. We need to be prepared for that." On the 4th morning, Eleanor woke to find that the train was slowing down. They were approaching Copper Creek, Montana Territory. Her stomach was full of butterflies as she gathered her belongings and prepared to meet Samuel Crawford. The train station in Copper Creek was nothing more than a wooden platform next to the tracks. There were perhaps a dozen buildings in the entire town, and they all looked like they had been built quickly with whatever materials were available. Eleanor stepped off the train and looked around nervously. She had no idea what Samuel Crawford looked like, since he had not sent a photograph. She scanned the small crowd of people who had come to meet the train. A young man with sandy hair approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me, miss. Are you Eleanor Mitchell?" Eleanor nodded, and the man's face fell slightly. She could see disappointment in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. "I am Jake Crawford, Samuel's brother. Sam had to stay at the ranch today because one of our cows is having trouble giving birth. He sent me to fetch you." Eleanor felt a surge of panic. Samuel had not even come to meet her himself, and she could see that Jake was shocked by her appearance. He had obviously been expecting someone younger and prettier. Jake helped Eleanor put her suitcase in his wagon, but he was clearly uncomfortable. As they drove through the town, Eleanor noticed people staring at her. A group of women standing outside the general store whispered to each other and pointed in her direction. "Is Sam really going to marry that old thing?" she heard one woman say. Jake's jaw tightened, but he did not respond to the comment. Eleanor felt humiliated. She had been in town for less than 10 minutes and already people were talking about her. The ride to the Crawford Ranch took about an hour. Jake made polite conversation, but Eleanor could tell he was worried about his brother's choice. She began to wonder if Samuel Crawford would take one look at her and send her back to Boston on the next train. As they drove across the vast Montana landscape, Eleanor tried to prepare herself for the possibility of immediate rejection. She had risked everything on this journey, but it was beginning to look like it might have been a terrible mistake. The ranch house appeared in the distance, small and lonely against the endless sky. Eleanor's heart pounded as they got closer. In a few minutes, she would meet the man who might become her husband, or who might dash her last hope for happiness. Eleanor sat on the wooden porch of the Crawford Ranch house, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for Samuel to return from the fields. Jake had helped her inside briefly to put down her suitcase, but then he had mumbled something about checking on the horses and disappeared. Eleanor could tell he was avoiding her. The ranch house was simple but clean. It had 3 rooms downstairs and what looked like a loft upstairs. The furniture was basic but well made, and Eleanor could see that someone had tried to make the place comfortable. There were clean curtains on the windows and a few books on a shelf near the fireplace. Eleanor had been sitting on the porch for about an hour when she saw a man riding toward the house. Her heart began to race. This had to be Samuel Crawford. As he got closer, she could see that he was tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair and a beard. He looked to be in his 30s, and he moved with the confident ease of someone who spent his life outdoors. Samuel dismounted his horse and looked at Eleanor for a long moment. She held her breath, waiting for the disappointment to show in his eyes the way it had in Jake's. But Samuel's expression was different. He looked thoughtful, almost curious, but not disappointed. "Miss Mitchell," he said, removing his hat. "Welcome to Montana territory." Eleanor stood up, smoothing her skirt nervously. "Mr. Crawford, thank you for having me here." Samuel nodded and tied his horse to the post. "I hope the journey was not too difficult. These western trains can be rough for someone not used to them." "It was fine," Eleanor said, though that was not entirely true. "Your brother Jake was very kind to meet me at the station." Samuel glanced toward the barn where Jake had disappeared. "I apologize for not meeting you myself. We had a cow in trouble and I could not leave her. She and her calf are both fine now." Eleanor was surprised by his explanation. Most men would have left animal care to their workers for something as important as meeting their potential bride. But Samuel spoke about the cow as if her welfare was genuinely important to him. "Please sit down," Samuel said, gesturing to the porch chairs. "We should talk." Eleanor sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. This was the moment when Samuel would decide whether to send her back to Boston. She tried to prepare herself for rejection. Samuel sat down beside her, but not too close. He studied her face carefully, and Eleanor felt as if he was trying to see into her soul. "Miss Mitchell," Samuel began slowly, "I need to be honest with you. The photograph you sent, it was not of you, was it?" Eleanor's face turned red. She had been caught in her deception immediately. I can explain." Samuel held up his hand. "Let me finish. I have been corresponding with mail-order brides for 3 years. In that time, I have learned to recognize when a photograph does not match the person who sent it. Usually, women send pictures of themselves from when they were much younger. You sent a picture of someone else entirely." Eleanor looked down at her hands. "It was my mother. People always said we looked very much alike. I hoped. You hoped I would not notice the difference," Samuel said. There was no anger in his voice, just sadness. "How old are you really, Miss Mitchell?" Eleanor knew there was no point in lying anymore. 32, she whispered. Samuel was quiet for a moment. "And you thought I would reject you because of your age?" Eleanor looked up at him in surprise. "Would you not? Most men want wives who are young enough to give them many children." Samuel leaned back in his chair. "Miss Mitchell, I am 35 years old. I have been trying to find a wife for years. Do you know why I have not succeeded?" Eleanor shook her head. Because every young woman who has come here has taken one look at this ranch and decided it was not what she wanted. They came here expecting to find a wealthy man with a big house and servants. What they found was a working ranch where the wife would need to work just as hard as the husband. Samuel pointed toward the fields. This is a hard life, Miss Mitchell. The winters are brutal. The summers are hot and dry. We are 20 miles from the nearest town, and that town is not much to speak of. A ranch wife needs to be strong, both in body and in spirit. She needs to be able to help with the cattle, tend a garden, preserve food for winter, and handle a rifle if necessary. Eleanor listened carefully. Everything Samuel was describing sounded difficult, but it also sounded purposeful. In Boston, her life had felt empty and meaningless. Here she would have real work to do, real contributions to make. The last woman who came here was 18 years old, Samuel continued. Pretty as a picture, but she cried when she saw a cow giving birth. She had never seen anything like it. She lasted 3 days before she begged me to send her back to her family. Eleanor thought about young Betty from the train, who had been so excited about her romantic Western adventure. What happened to her? She married the banker in town within a month, Samuel said with a slight smile. They seem happy enough, but she would never have been happy here. Samuel turned to face Eleanor directly. Miss Mitchell, I do not care that you are 32 years old. I do not care that you are not the prettiest woman in the territory. What I care about is whether you can handle the reality of this life. Eleanor felt a spark of hope. I believe I can, Mr. Crawford. I have been managing households since I was 16. I helped my father with his medical practice, so I am not squeamish about blood or difficult situations. I can cook, clean, sew, and manage money. I am not afraid of hard work. Samuel nodded approvingly. That is what I hope to hear. But I want you to understand something else. I am not a wealthy man. This ranch provides a decent living, but we will never be rich. We grow most of our own food, make most of our own clothes, and go without many things that city people consider necessities. I understand, Eleanor said. I have been living in poverty for the past year. I know what it means to do without luxuries. Samuel stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. There is something else you should know. This town, the people here can be harsh in their judgments. They have already seen you, and they are already talking. Eleanor's heart sank. What are they saying? They are saying I must be desperate to consider marrying a woman your age. They are saying you must be desperate to travel so far to find a husband. Some of them are taking bets on how long you will last before you give up and go home. Eleanor felt tears stinging her eyes. And what do you say to that? Samuel turned back to her, and she was surprised to see anger in his eyes, but the anger was not directed at her. I say that people who have nothing better to do than gossip about other people's business need to find more useful ways to spend their time, Samuel said firmly. I say that anyone who judges a person's worth by their age or appearance is a fool. Just then, Jake appeared from around the corner of the house, leading 3 neighbors who had apparently come to visit. Eleanor recognized 2 of the women from the group she had seen whispering outside the general store. Sam, called out one of the men, a heavy-set fellow with a thick mustache. We thought we would come by and meet your lady friend. Eleanor could tell from their expressions that this was not a friendly social call. These people had come to look at her like she was some kind of curiosity. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he maintained his politeness. Eleanor, I would like you to meet our neighbors. This is Bill Henderson and his wife Ruth and Mrs. Dorothy Kane. Mrs. Henderson looked Eleanor up and down with obvious disapproval. My, she is. Older than we expected. And not nearly as pretty as that photograph you showed around town, added Mrs. Kane with a smirk. Eleanor felt her face burning with embarrassment, but Samuel stepped forward. Eleanor has just arrived after a very long journey, Samuel said coldly. She is tired and needs time to rest. Perhaps you could save your visit for another day. Bill Henderson laughed. Oh, come on, Sam, we are just curious about your bride-to-be. After all, you have been looking for a wife for so long. We want to make sure she is suitable. Samuel's eyes flashed dangerously. Eleanor is more than suitable. She is intelligent, capable, and brave enough to start a new life in a place she has never seen. That takes more courage than any of you have ever shown. Mrs. Henderson sniffed. Well, I suppose beggars cannot be choosers. That comment was too much for Samuel. I think you need to leave now, he said, his voice low and threatening. And if I hear any of you spreading cruel gossip about Eleanor in town, you will answer to me. The neighbors left quickly, muttering among themselves. Eleanor sat in stunned silence. No one had ever defended her like that before. Samuel sat back down beside her. I am sorry you had to see that. Some people in this town have too much time on their hands and too little kindness in their hearts. Eleanor looked at him with new respect. You did not have to defend me like that. You barely know me. Samuel met her eyes steadily. Eleanor, if you decide to stay here and marry me, you will be my wife. That means you will have my loyalty and protection, no matter what anyone else thinks or says. For the first time since leaving Boston, Eleanor felt like she might have made the right decision. Samuel Crawford was clearly a man of integrity and strength, but she also knew that the hardest part of this journey was just beginning. Eleanor woke up before dawn on her third day at the Crawford Ranch. She had been sleeping in the small guest room, while Samuel slept in the loft upstairs. They had agreed to wait a few weeks before making any final decisions about marriage, giving both of them time to get to know each other better. Through her small window, Eleanor could see Samuel already out in the barn tending to the animals. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen to start breakfast. She had noticed that Samuel usually just ate bread and coffee in the morning before heading out to work. But Eleanor believed a man doing hard physical labor needed a proper meal. When Samuel came in from the barn, he found bacon frying in the pan, fresh biscuits in the oven, and eggs ready to scramble. He stopped in the doorway looking surprised. You did not have to do all this, he said. I usually just grab something quick. Eleanor smiled as she poured him coffee. A man needs real food to start his day. Besides, I enjoy cooking when I have good ingredients to work with. Samuel sat down at the table and took a sip of coffee. His eyes widened slightly. This is excellent coffee. How did you make it so much better than mine? Just a little trick my mother taught me, Eleanor said, pleased by his reaction. You add just a pinch of salt to cut the bitterness. Over breakfast, Samuel told Eleanor about his plans for the day. One of the cows was showing signs of illness and he needed to check on her. He also wanted to ride out to the far pasture to count the cattle and make sure none had wandered off. Is there anything I can do to help? Eleanor asked. Samuel looked at her thoughtfully. Can you really handle being around sick animals? It can be unpleasant. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. Mr. Crawford, I helped my father deliver babies and treat all manner of illnesses. I do not think a sick cow will shock me. Samuel decided to test her resolve. He took Eleanor out to the barn where the sick cow was lying in a stall. The animal was clearly suffering, breathing heavily and refusing to eat. Eleanor knelt down beside the cow without hesitation and gently examined her. She has a fever, Eleanor said, feeling the cow's ears and nose. And look at her gums. They are too pale. She might have eaten something poisonous or she could have an infection. Samuel was impressed by Eleanor's calm, practical approach. What would you suggest? Eleanor thought for a moment. In my father's medical books, there are several remedies for livestock. We could try giving her charcoal mixed with water if we think she ate something bad. Or we could make a tea from willow bark to bring down the fever. Samuel had been planning to send for the veterinarian, who lived 30 miles away and charged high fees. Let us try your remedies first, he said. Working together, Eleanor and Samuel prepared the treatments. Eleanor ground charcoal while Samuel held the cow's head. They managed to get the mixture down the animal's throat, and then Eleanor prepared the willow bark tea. We should check on her every few hours, Eleanor said, washing her hands at the pump. If she is not better by tomorrow, we may need to try something else. That afternoon, while Samuel rode out to check the cattle, Eleanor decided to tackle the vegetable garden behind the house. It was clear that no one had paid much attention to it recently. Weeds were choking out the vegetables and many plants were dying from lack of water. Eleanor spent hours pulling weeds, watering plants, and staking up tomato vines that had fallen over. By evening, the garden looked much better. She also discovered that there were more vegetables ready for harvest than Samuel had realized. When Samuel returned that evening, he found Eleanor on the porch, shelling beans she had picked from the garden. A large basket beside her was full of tomatoes, squash, and onions. Where did all this come from? Samuel asked, amazed. Your garden, Eleanor said with a smile. It just needed a little attention. We should preserve some of these vegetables for winter. Do you have canning jars? Samuel admitted that he usually just bought canned goods from town when he needed them. Eleanor shook her head. That is expensive and unnecessary when you can grow so much here. Tomorrow I will show you how to preserve these properly. That evening they checked on the sick cow together. The animal was standing up and had drunk some water. Her breathing seemed easier, and she had even eaten a little hay. "Your remedies worked," Samuel said, clearly impressed. "Dr. Morgan charges $5 just to come look at a sick animal, and he probably would not have done any better." Eleanor felt a warm glow of pride. "My father always said that many old remedies work just as well as expensive medicines." Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor continued to prove her worth around the ranch. She organized the house, putting everything in logical places and making the daily routines more efficient. She preserved vegetables, mended clothes, and even helped Samuel repair a broken fence. More importantly, Eleanor and Samuel began to really talk to each other. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and share stories about their past lives. Eleanor told Samuel about growing up in Boston, about her father's medical practice, and about the loneliness she had felt after her father died. Samuel told Eleanor about building the ranch from nothing, about the hard winters when he had almost given up, and about the loneliness of living so far from other people. He also told her about the other women who had come to marry him. "The first one was named Jennifer," Samuel said one evening. "She was 19 and very pretty, but she had never lived anywhere except in a big city. She was afraid of the horses, afraid of the cattle, and afraid of the silence at night. She said the emptiness made her feel like she was going crazy." Eleanor could understand that feeling. The vastness of Montana had been overwhelming at first, but she was beginning to find peace in the wide open spaces. "The second woman was named Patricia," Samuel continued. "She was practical and hard-working, but she had very different ideas about what our life should be like. She wanted me to sell the ranch and move to California, where her sister lived. She said ranching was too risky and too lonely. Did you consider it?" Eleanor asked. Samuel shook his head. "This ranch is my life's work. I built it with my own hands, and I'm not willing to give it up. I need a wife who can be happy here, not someone who is just waiting for me to change my whole life." Eleanor understood. Samuel was not just looking for any wife. He was looking for a partner who could share his vision and his commitment to the ranch. But their growing friendship was tested when visitors arrived from town. Samuel's sister-in-law Martha came for a visit, bringing her 2 young daughters. Martha was married to Samuel's older brother who lived in town, and she clearly had strong opinions about Samuel's choice of bride. Martha was a small, sharp-faced woman who spoke her mind without worrying about other people's feelings. She took one look at Eleanor and made her disapproval clear. "Samuel, what were you thinking?" Martha said while Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing dinner. "She is practically an old maid, and she is not even pretty. Surely you could have found someone better." Eleanor could hear every word from the kitchen, and her face burned with embarrassment, but she continued preparing the meal, determined not to let Martha's rudeness affect her. "I think Eleanor is exactly what I need," Samuel replied firmly. "She is intelligent, capable, and hardworking. What more could I ask for?" Martha lowered her voice, but not enough. "But Samuel, what about children? She's already 32. How many children can you expect her to give you?" Eleanor's hands trembled as she stirred the stew. This was her greatest fear. She wanted children desperately, but she knew that her age made pregnancy riskier and less likely. Samuel's voice became cold. "Martha, Eleanor is my guest and my friend. I will not have you talking about her like she is a piece of livestock being evaluated for breeding." That evening at dinner, Martha continued her subtle attacks. She talked about all the young, pretty women in town who were still unmarried. She mentioned how nice it would be for Samuel to have a wife who could give him a whole house full of children. Eleanor tried to maintain her dignity, but she could feel her confidence crumbling. Maybe Martha was right. Maybe Samuel deserved someone younger who could give him the large family he probably wanted. After Martha and her daughters left the next day, Eleanor and Samuel had their first real argument. "You should not let Martha upset you," Samuel said as they sat on the porch that evening. "She is right, though," Eleanor said quietly. "I am too old. You should find someone younger." Samuel turned to face her, his eyes serious. "Eleanor, do you want children?" "More than anything," Eleanor whispered. "Then we will hope for children," Samuel said simply. "But even if we never have children, I would rather have you as my wife than a younger woman who cannot handle this life." Eleanor looked at him in amazement. "You really mean that?" "I do," Samuel said. "Eleanor, I have been alone for 35 years. I have learned the difference between wanting someone and needing someone. I want children, yes, but I need a partner. I need someone I can talk to, someone I can trust, someone who makes me feel less alone in the world. That night, Eleanor lay in bed thinking about Samuel's words. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could really work. But she also knew that the hardest test was still to come. She had not yet faced a Montana winter, and she had not yet met the full force of the town's disapproval. The first snow came earlier than expected, just 3 weeks after Eleanor's arrival in Montana territory. She woke up one morning to find the world outside transformed into a white wonderland that stretched as far as the eye could see. What had started as light flurries the night before had turned into a serious snowstorm during the night. Samuel was already up, standing at the kitchen window with a worried expression on his face. "This is not good," he said when Eleanor joined him. "We are supposed to get the cattle moved to the winter pasture today, but this storm looks like it is going to get worse before it gets better." Eleanor looked outside at the swirling snow. She had never seen anything like it. In Boston, snowstorms were inconvenient, but they did not threaten people's lives or livelihoods. Here she was beginning to understand snow could be dangerous. "What do we need to do?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Samuel was already putting on his heavy coat and boots. "I need to get the cattle moved to shelter before the storm gets worse. Some of them are still in the far pasture, and if they get trapped out there, we could lose them." Eleanor watched Samuel prepare to go out into the storm, and she felt helpless. In Boston, during bad weather, people simply stayed inside until it passed. But ranch life did not allow for that luxury. The animals depended on Samuel for their survival, no matter what the weather was like. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Eleanor asked. Samuel shook his head. "Just keep the fire going and have hot food ready when I get back. This is going to take most of the day." Samuel left the house, and Eleanor spent the morning watching anxiously out the window. She could barely see him through the blowing snow, even when he was close to the house. When he rode out toward the far pasture, he disappeared completely into the white wall of snow. Eleanor tried to keep busy. She baked bread, made a big pot of stew, and prepared hot coffee. She also gathered extra firewood from the pile on the porch, sensing that they might need it. But mostly she worried about Samuel, alone out there in the storm. By afternoon, the storm had gotten much worse. The wind was howling around the house, and snow was piling up against the windows. Eleanor had never experienced anything like it. The isolation was overwhelming. She could not see the barn, which was only 50 yards from the house. The world beyond the walls of the house seemed to have completely disappeared. When Samuel finally returned in the late afternoon, he was covered with snow and ice, and his face was red with cold. Eleanor helped him out of his frozen coat and boots, and she could see that he was exhausted. "Did you get all the cattle moved?" Eleanor asked, handing him a cup of hot coffee. Samuel nodded, but his expression was grim. "Barely. I lost 2 calves who got separated from the herd, and this storm is far from over. The temperature is dropping fast and the wind is getting stronger." That evening they sat by the fire and listened to the storm rage outside. The wind sounded like a wild animal trying to tear the house apart. Eleanor had never heard anything so frightening. "Is the house strong enough to withstand this?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Samuel nodded. "I built it to handle Montana winters. But this is an unusually early storm, and it is stronger than most. We might be trapped here for several days." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "Trapped? The snow will be too deep to get to town and the roads will be impassable," Samuel explained. "We will have enough food and firewood, but we will be completely cut off from the outside world until the storm passes and the snow melts enough for travel." That night, Eleanor lay in her bed listening to the storm and trying not to panic. The sound of the wind was terrifying, and the house creaked and groaned under the force of it. She had never felt so isolated and vulnerable in her life. The next morning, Eleanor woke to an eerie silence. The wind had stopped, but when she looked outside, she gasped. The snow was piled up to the windows, and the entire landscape was buried under several feet of white. The barn was just a dark shape, barely visible through the snow. Samuel was already up, digging a path from the house to the barn so he could tend to the animals. It was hard, exhausting work, and Eleanor could see that it would have to be repeated every day until the snow melted. "Let me help," Eleanor said, putting on her coat. Samuel shook his head. "This is too hard for you. The snow is heavy and the cold is dangerous if you are not used to it, but Eleanor insisted. She had never done this kind of physical labor before, but she was determined to prove that she could handle ranch life, even at its most difficult. Together they spent hours shoveling snow and creating paths to the barn, the chicken coop, and the woodpile. By the third day of being trapped in the house, Eleanor and Samuel had settled into a routine. Samuel would tend to the animals and maintain the paths through the snow. Eleanor would keep the fire going, prepare meals, and try to make their small world as comfortable as possible. But the forced intimacy was also creating an unexpected closeness between them. With nowhere to go and nothing to do except talk, they began sharing deeper parts of their lives with each other. "I have to admit something," Eleanor said one evening as they sat by the fire. "I was terrified when I first got here. Not just of you, but of this whole life. I had no idea what I was getting myself into." Samuel smiled. "I was terrified too. I was afraid you would take one look at this place and run back to Boston as fast as you could." Eleanor looked around the small, warm room. "It is not what I expected. It is harder than I thought it would be, but it is also more real than anything I have ever experienced. In Boston, I felt like I was just waiting for my life to begin. Here I feel like I am actually living." Samuel reached over and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her since she arrived, and Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. "Eleanor," Samuel said seriously, "I need you to understand something. This storm is nothing compared to what winter will really be like. We will be snowed in for months at a time. There will be weeks when we do not see another human being. The isolation can drive people crazy, especially people who are used to city life." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Are you trying to scare me away?" "I am trying to be honest with you," Samuel said. "I am falling in love with you, Eleanor. But I need to know that you can handle this life, because if you cannot, it will break both our hearts." Eleanor felt tears coming to her eyes. "You are falling in love with me?" Samuel nodded. "I did not expect it to happen so quickly, but you are everything I have been looking for. You are strong, you are brave, and you make this place feel like a real home instead of just a house where I live alone." Eleanor felt a warmth spreading through her chest. "I am falling in love with you too, Samuel, but I have to be honest about something as well." Samuel waited for her to continue. "I am terrified that I am too old to give you children," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am terrified that you will eventually regret choosing me over a younger woman." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor, do you know why I never married when I was younger?" Eleanor shook her head. "Because I was too busy building this ranch to pay attention to finding a wife. By the time I realized how lonely I was, most of the good women my age were already married. I tried courting a few younger women, but they all seemed like children to me. I could not imagine having serious conversations with them about life, about dreams, about the challenges we would face together." Samuel turned to face Eleanor directly. "I want a partner, not just a wife. I want someone I can respect and trust and talk to. If God blesses us with children, I will be grateful. But if he does not, I will still be grateful to have you." Eleanor felt tears running down her face. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. No one had ever made her feel so valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. That night, the wind picked up again, and they could hear tree branches snapping under the weight of ice and snow. Eleanor and Samuel sat close together on the small sofa, sharing warmth and comfort. "Eleanor," Samuel said softly, "when this storm passes, will you marry me?" Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and love. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." But even as she said the words, Eleanor felt a nagging fear in the back of her mind. The storm had brought them together, but it had also shown her just how isolated and vulnerable life on the ranch could be. What would happen when they went back to town and faced the judgment of the community? What would happen when the excitement of their new love wore off and they settled into the daily routine of married life? Eleanor pushed those thoughts away and focused on the warmth of Samuel's arms around her. For now, in this moment, she was exactly where she wanted to be. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she was content to simply be loved and to love in return. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small ranch house, two people had found something worth fighting for. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a world that looked completely different from the one Eleanor had first seen. Snow covered everything in deep drifts, and the silence was so complete it felt almost magical. Eleanor stood at the window marveling at how beautiful and terrifying the landscape looked at the same time. Samuel spent most of that day digging out paths and checking on the animals. Several chickens had died from the cold, and one of the older cows was showing signs of frostbite on her ears. But overall, they had weathered the storm better than Samuel had feared. "We should be able to get to town in a day or two," Samuel told Eleanor over dinner. "The main road will take time to clear, but I can take the horse through the back trails." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. During the storm, she had felt safe and protected in their small world. The thought of returning to town and facing people's judgment filled her with dread. "Do we have to go to town so soon?" Eleanor asked. "Could we not wait a bit longer?" Samuel looked at her with concern. "Eleanor, we need supplies. The storm used up most of our firewood, and we are running low on several things. Besides, people will be worried about us." Eleanor nodded, but she could not shake the feeling that going to town would somehow break the spell of happiness they had found during the storm. The next morning, Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of a horse approaching the house. She looked out the window and saw Martha, Samuel's sister-in-law, riding toward them through the snow. Martha's horse was struggling through the deep drifts, and she looked cold and angry. Samuel came in from the barn just as Martha reached the porch. "Martha, what are you doing out here?" "The roads are still dangerous." Martha dismounted her horse with obvious difficulty. "I had to come, Samuel. There are things you need to know." Eleanor felt a chill of foreboding as Martha entered the house. The woman's face was flushed with cold and excitement, and her eyes held a gleam that suggested she had come to deliver unpleasant news. "Martha, sit down and warm yourself," Samuel said, though his tone was not particularly welcoming. "Eleanor, could you make some hot coffee?" Eleanor busied herself with the coffee pot, but she could hear every word of the conversation from the kitchen. "Samuel, there is a new woman in town," Martha said without preamble. "She arrived on the train 2 days before the storm hit. She is young and beautiful, and she's looking for a husband." Eleanor's hand trembled as she poured the coffee. She had been dreading this moment. She knew that other women would continue to arrive in Montana territory, and she had always feared that Samuel would compare her unfavorably to someone younger and prettier. "What does that have to do with me?" Samuel asked coldly. "I am engaged to Eleanor," Martha laughed. "Samuel, you are not married yet. You still have time to change your mind. This woman, her name is Victoria. She is only 23 years old. She is educated, well-dressed, and she comes from a good family. She has money of her own, so she would not be marrying you for financial security." Eleanor brought the coffee to the sitting room, her hands shaking slightly. Martha accepted the cup without thanking her and continued her speech. "Victoria has been asking about you specifically, Samuel. She heard that you were one of the most successful ranchers in the territory, and she is very interested in meeting you." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Martha, I'm not interested in meeting this woman. I'm going to marry Eleanor." Martha turned to look at Eleanor with barely concealed contempt. "Samuel, be practical. This Eleanor woman is 32 years old. How many children can you realistically expect from her? And look at her. She is plain. She has no money, and she has no family connections that could help you." Eleanor felt each word like a physical blow. All of her worst fears were being spoken out loud. "Now compare that to Victoria," Martha continued. "She is young enough to give you many children. She is beautiful enough that you could be proud to introduce her to anyone, and she has enough money that you could expand the ranch, maybe even buy the Henderson property that borders yours." Samuel stood up abruptly. "Martha, I think you should leave." But Martha was not finished. "Samuel, everyone in town is talking about this. They are saying you must be desperate or crazy to consider marrying an old maid, when you could have your pick of younger women. They are betting on how long it will take before you come to your senses." Eleanor could not listen anymore. She set down her coffee cup and walked quickly to her room, closing the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her whole body shaking. Martha's words had confirmed every fear she had been trying to suppress. She could hear Martha and Samuel arguing in the next room, but she could not make out the words. After about 10 minutes, she heard the front door slam and the sound of Martha's horse riding away. Samuel knocked on Eleanor's door a few minutes later. "Eleanor, can I come in?" Eleanor wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. "Yes." Samuel entered the room and sat down beside her on the bed. Eleanor, please do not let Martha upset you. She has no right to say those things. Eleanor looked at him with tears in her eyes. But she is right, is she not? This Victoria woman sounds perfect for you. Young, beautiful, wealthy. Everything I am not. Samuel took Eleanor's hands in his. Eleanor, listen to me. I do not want Victoria. I do not care how young or beautiful or wealthy she is. I want you. Eleanor shook her head. Samuel, you should at least meet her. What if you find that you prefer her to me? What if you realize that you settled for me because you thought you had no other choice? Samuel's eyes flashed with anger. Is that what you think? That I am settling for you? Eleanor stood up and walked to the window. Samuel, I have been rejected by men my entire adult life. I know what it feels like when someone chooses you only because they cannot have what they really want. I could not bear to have that happen with you. Samuel stood up and put his hands on Eleanor's shoulders, turning her to face him. Eleanor, do you remember what I told you during the storm? I said I was falling in love with you. That was not desperation talking. That was not loneliness. That was love. Eleanor looked into his eyes, wanting desperately to believe him. But Samuel, what if you are wrong? What if you meet this Victoria and realize that you made a mistake? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor, if meeting this woman is the only way to convince you that I know my own mind, then I will meet her. But I already know what I will find. I will find a young woman who sees me as a means to an end. I will find someone who wants to marry the successful rancher, not the man who gets up before dawn to tend sick cattle. Eleanor felt a tear roll down her cheek. And what will you find with me? Samuel cupped her face in his hands. I will find a woman who worked beside me during a blizzard without complaining. I will find someone who saved my sick cow with remedies she learned from her father. I will find a partner who makes me feel less alone in the world. Samuel paused and looked deeply into Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor, I have waited 35 years for someone like you. I have waited for someone who would see this ranch as a home to build together, not as a hardship to endure. I have waited for someone who would love me for who I am, not for what I can provide. Eleanor felt her resistance crumbling. Samuel, I want to believe you, but I am so afraid. Samuel pulled her into his arms. Eleanor, I understand your fear. You have been hurt before, but I am asking you to trust me. I am asking you to believe that what we have found together is real and worth fighting for. Eleanor buried her face in Samuel's chest and let herself cry. She cried for all the years of loneliness and rejection. She cried for all the fears and insecurities that threatened to destroy her chance at happiness. And she cried with relief that someone finally saw her as worthy of love. Samuel, Eleanor whispered, I do not want you to meet Victoria, because you feel obligated to prove something to me. If you want to meet her, it should be because you genuinely want to. Samuel pulled back and looked at her seriously. Eleanor, the only thing I want is to marry you and start our life together. But if meeting this woman will help you trust in my choice, then I will do it. Because I want you to come to our marriage with confidence, not with doubt. Eleanor thought about this for a long moment. Part of her wanted to forbid Samuel from meeting Victoria, to keep him away from temptation. But she knew that would not be fair. If Samuel was going to choose her, it should be because he genuinely preferred her, not because he never had the chance to consider alternatives. All right, Eleanor said finally. Meet her. But Samuel, if you find that you prefer her to me, please be honest with me. I would rather face that heartbreak now than discover it after we are married. Samuel kissed Eleanor's forehead gently. Eleanor, I will meet her if it will ease your mind. But I can tell you right now what the outcome will be. I will come home to you and I will ask you again to marry me. And this time I hope you will say yes without any doubts. Eleanor looked up at Samuel and saw nothing but love and certainty in his eyes. For the first time since Martha's visit, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Samuel really did know his own heart. Maybe she really was the woman he wanted, not just the woman he had settled for. I love you, Samuel, Eleanor said quietly. 2 days after Martha's visit, Samuel and Eleanor made their way to town for the first time since the storm. The roads were still difficult to navigate, but Samuel had managed to clear a path with his horse and wagon. Eleanor sat beside him, bundled in her warmest coat, trying to calm her nerves about what they would face in Copper Creek. The town looked different, covered in snow. The buildings seemed smaller and more isolated, and there were fewer people on the streets. But Eleanor could see faces in windows as they passed, and she knew that news of their arrival would spread quickly. Their first stop was the general store to buy supplies. Eleanor had hoped they could complete their business quickly and return to the ranch, but she soon realized that was not going to be possible. The store was crowded with people who had come to town for the first time since the storm, and everyone seemed eager to see Samuel and his mail-order bride. Well, said Bill Henderson, the man who had visited the ranch with his wife. Look who survived the storm. Samuel, we were beginning to wonder if you and your lady friend had frozen to death out there. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he remained polite. We managed just fine, Bill. The ranch is built to handle Montana winters. Mrs. Henderson appeared from behind a shelf of canned goods, her eyes bright with curiosity. And how did you find your first Montana blizzard, dear? She asked Eleanor with false sweetness. I imagine it was quite different from anything you experienced in Boston. Eleanor lifted her chin. It was certainly challenging, but we managed very well together. Oh, I am sure you did, Mrs. Henderson said with a smirk. Though I hear there is a new young lady in town who might be of interest to certain people. Eleanor felt her stomach drop, but Samuel stepped closer to her side. I am not interested in meeting anyone else, Mrs. Henderson. Eleanor and I are engaged to be married. Just then the store door opened and a young woman entered. Eleanor knew immediately that this had to be Victoria. She was everything Martha had described and more. Tall and graceful, with golden hair and bright blue eyes, she moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own worth. Her clothes were expensive and fashionable, and she carried herself like a queen. The entire store fell silent as Victoria entered. Eleanor could feel every eye in the place watching to see what would happen next. Victoria looked around the store until her gaze settled on Samuel. Excuse me, she said in a cultured voice, but are you Mr. Samuel Crawford? Samuel nodded stiffly. I am. Victoria smiled brilliantly. How wonderful. I have been hoping to meet you. I am Victoria Whitman. Perhaps Mrs. Crawford mentioned me to you. She did, Samuel said coldly. But as I told her, I am engaged to be married. Victoria's eyes flicked to Eleanor, and Eleanor saw a flash of surprise and then dismissal cross the young woman's face. It was clear that Victoria had not expected any real competition from someone like Eleanor. Oh, how lovely, Victoria said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but lovely. And you must be the mail-order bride I have heard so much about. Eleanor felt every eye in the store watching her reaction. She knew that this moment would define how the town saw her from now on. She could shrink away and let Victoria's youth and beauty intimidate her, or she could stand her ground. I am Eleanor Mitchell, Eleanor said clearly. And yes, I came here to marry Samuel. Victoria smiled, but there was something calculating in her expression. How brave of you to travel so far at your stage of life. It must have been quite an adventure. Eleanor felt the sting of the comment about her age, but she refused to let it show. It was indeed an adventure. And it has led me to exactly where I belong. Samuel stepped forward, placing his hand protectively on Eleanor's back. Victoria, was there something specific you needed, or are you just here to satisfy your curiosity? Victoria's smile faltered slightly at Samuel's cool tone. Actually, I was hoping you might show me around your ranch sometime. I am very interested in learning about cattle ranching. Samuel's response was immediate and firm. I am afraid that would not be appropriate. As I mentioned, I am engaged to Eleanor. Victoria looked genuinely shocked. It was clear that she was not accustomed to being rejected by men. Surely there would be no harm in a simple tour. I could bring a chaperone. The answer is no, Samuel said firmly. The store had become completely silent. Everyone was watching this drama unfold, and Eleanor could see the excitement in their faces. This was exactly the kind of entertainment that small towns thrived on. Victoria's mask of sweetness finally slipped. Mr. Crawford, I think you might be making a mistake. After all, you barely know this woman. Perhaps you should consider your options more carefully. Samuel's eyes flashed dangerously. Miss Whitman, I know Eleanor well enough to know that she is exactly the woman I want to marry. I am not interested in considering other options. Victoria looked around the store, clearly realizing that she was not getting the reception she had expected. Well, she said with forced brightness, I suppose some men prefer more mature women. The comment hung in the air like a slap. Eleanor felt her face burn with humiliation. But before she could respond, Samuel stepped forward. Miss Whitman, Samuel said in a voice that was quiet but deadly serious, I think you need to understand something. Eleanor is not just more mature. She is intelligent, capable, brave, and kind. She is everything I have been looking for in a wife. Any man would be lucky to have her. Victoria's face flushed red. Mr. Crawford, you cannot possibly mean that you prefer an old maid to a young woman who could give you a proper family. The store erupted in whispers at Victoria's boldness. Even for a small town that thrived on gossip, this was shocking behavior. Samuel's voice became even quieter, which somehow made it more frightening. Miss Whitman, I suggest you think very carefully about your next words. You are insulting my future wife, and I will not tolerate that from anyone. Victoria seemed to realize that she had gone too far. I simply meant, I know exactly what you meant, Samuel said, and I think this conversation is over. Victoria looked around the store, clearly hoping for support from the other customers. But the faces she saw were no longer admiring. Even people who had been gossiping about Eleanor now looked uncomfortable with Victoria's cruel behavior. Mrs. Henderson, who had been enjoying the drama, now seemed to realize that Victoria had crossed a line. Perhaps we should all mind our own business, she said weakly. Victoria gathered what remained of her dignity and headed for the door. But before she left, she turned back to Eleanor. I hope you know what you're getting yourself into, Victoria said. Ranch life is not easy for someone your age. Eleanor had remained silent through most of the confrontation, but now she found her voice. Miss Whitman, I have faced harder things than ranch life. I have buried my parents, survived poverty, and traveled across the country to start a new life. I think I can handle whatever challenges come my way. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. She had expected Eleanor to be intimidated, but instead she had found someone who was willing to fight back. Besides, Eleanor continued, age brings wisdom and strength that youth often lacks. I may not be 23 anymore, but I know who I am and what I want. I doubt you can say the same. Victoria's face turned bright red. Without another word, she stormed out of the store, slamming the door behind her. The store remained silent for several moments after Victoria left. Then gradually, people began to move and talk again, but Eleanor could feel that something had changed. The way people looked at her was different now. She had stood up for herself and held her ground against someone younger and supposedly more desirable. Samuel squeezed Eleanor's hand. I am proud of you, he whispered. Eleanor felt a surge of confidence. I am proud of myself, too. As they finished their shopping, Eleanor noticed that several people made a point of speaking to her kindly. Mrs. Chen, who ran the small restaurant, invited Eleanor to visit whenever she was in town. The elderly doctor complimented her on the way she had handled Victoria. Even some of the women who had been whispering about her earlier now seemed to view her with new respect. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, Samuel turned to Eleanor. Are you ready to go home? Eleanor looked around the town that she was beginning to think of as her new community. Yes, she said firmly. I am ready to go home. On the ride back to the ranch, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in weeks. She had faced her greatest fear and survived. She had stood up to someone who represented everything she was not, and she had not been found wanting. Samuel, Eleanor said as they approached the ranch house, I have something to tell you. Samuel looked at her with concern. What is it? Eleanor smiled. I do not need you to prove anything to me anymore. I know you love me, and I know you chose me. Victoria could be the most beautiful woman in the world, and it would not matter. You are mine, and I am yours. Samuel stopped the wagon and turned to face Eleanor. Does that mean you will marry me without any more doubts? Eleanor laughed, feeling truly happy for the first time since arriving in Montana. Yes, Samuel Crawford. I will marry you, and I will be the best ranch wife you could ever ask for. Samuel kissed her right there in the wagon, and Eleanor kissed him back with all the love and determination in her heart. She had found her place in the world. The wedding took place 3 weeks later on a crisp December morning. Eleanor had wanted a simple ceremony, but Samuel insisted that they invite the whole town. I want everyone to see how proud I am to marry you, he had said, and Eleanor's heart had swelled with happiness. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had carefully altered to fit her. It was made of ivory silk with delicate lace trim, and though it was not the most fashionable style, it was beautiful in its simplicity. Samuel wore his best suit, and Eleanor thought he looked more handsome than any man had a right to. The ceremony was held in the small church in Copper Creek. Pastor Williams, who had initially seemed skeptical about the marriage, had warmed to Eleanor after hearing about how she had stood up to Victoria in the general store. Word of that confrontation had spread throughout the town, and people's opinions of Eleanor had begun to change. As Eleanor walked down the aisle, she saw faces that had once looked at her with pity or contempt, now watching her with respect and even admiration. Mrs. Chen beamed at her from the front row. The elderly doctor nodded approvingly. Even Mrs. Henderson seemed to have developed a grudging respect for the woman who had refused to be intimidated. Victoria was notably absent from the ceremony. She had left town the week before, reportedly heading to California to visit relatives. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in Victoria's departure, only relief that the drama was finally over. When Pastor Williams asked if anyone objected to the marriage, the church remained completely silent. Samuel and Eleanor exchanged vows that they had written themselves, promising to love and support each other through all the challenges that ranch life would bring. "Eleanor," Samuel said, his voice strong and clear, "I promise to cherish you for exactly who you are. You are not too old, you are not second best, and you are not a consolation prize. You are the woman I have been waiting for my entire life, and I will spend every day proving that I know how lucky I am to have found you." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she spoke her own vows. "Samuel, I promise to be your partner in every sense of the word. I will work beside you, dream with you, and face whatever challenges come our way. I am done apologizing for my age or doubting my worth. You have shown me that love is not about being perfect or young or beautiful. Love is about finding someone who sees your true value and chooses you anyway." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Eleanor with such tenderness and joy that the entire congregation burst into applause. Eleanor felt like her heart might burst with happiness. She was no longer Eleanor Mitchell, the old maid from Boston. She was Eleanor Crawford, ranch wife and beloved partner. The reception was held in the town hall, and it was a livelier affair than Eleanor had expected. The people of Copper Creek might be rough around the edges, but they knew how to celebrate. There was dancing, plenty of food, and even a few toasts to the new couple. Jake Crawford, who had initially been so disappointed by Eleanor's appearance, stood up to make a speech. "When my brother first told me he was getting a mail-order bride, I thought he was making a mistake," Jake said honestly. "I thought he was settling for someone because he was lonely. But I was wrong." Jake looked directly at Eleanor. "Eleanor, you have brought life back to my brother and to that ranch. You have shown all of us what real strength looks like. Any man would be proud to call you wife, and any community would be lucky to have you as a neighbor." Eleanor felt tears in her eyes again. To be accepted by Samuel's family meant everything to her. The biggest surprise of the evening came when Mrs. Henderson approached Eleanor during the dancing. "Mrs. Crawford," she said formally, "I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly when you first arrived, and I said things that were unkind and unnecessary." Eleanor was too shocked to respond immediately. Mrs. Henderson continued, "What you did in the general store last week, standing up to that snooty Victoria girl, that took real courage, and the way you have worked to make a place for yourself here, that takes character. I hope you will forgive an old woman for speaking before she thought." Eleanor smiled warmly. "Of course I forgive you, Mrs. Henderson. We all make mistakes when we are trying to protect our community. I understand that." Mrs. Henderson looked relieved. "I hope we can be friends, Mrs. Crawford. This town needs more women like you." As the evening wound down, Samuel and Eleanor rode back to their ranch under a sky full of stars. The house looked warm and welcoming with lamplight glowing in the windows, and Eleanor felt a deep sense of coming home. "Mrs. Crawford," Samuel said as he helped her down from the wagon, "how does it feel to be a married woman?" Eleanor laughed. "It feels perfect, Mr. Crawford, absolutely perfect." Their first year of marriage brought all the challenges Samuel had warned Eleanor about, but it also brought more joy than she had ever imagined possible. The winter was indeed harsh, with several more blizzards that trapped them in the house for days at a time. But Eleanor found that she loved those quiet times when it was just the two of them, working together to keep their small world running smoothly. Eleanor proved to be everything Samuel had hoped for in a ranch wife. She learned to help with the cattle, to preserve food for the long winters, and to handle a rifle when necessary. When spring came, Her garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, and she spent happy hours teaching other ranch wives her preservation techniques. The people of Copper Creek gradually came to see Eleanor as an integral part of their community. When the school teacher left town unexpectedly, Eleanor volunteered to teach the children until a replacement could be found. Her education and patience made her a natural teacher, and several families asked her to continue even after the new teacher arrived. Eleanor also became the unofficial medical advisor for the community. Her knowledge from helping her father proved invaluable in a place where the nearest doctor was often days away. She helped deliver babies, treated injuries, and provided remedies for everything from colds to broken bones. But the greatest joy came in their second year of marriage, when Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She was 34 years old, and she had almost given up hope of having children. When she told Samuel the news, he picked her up and spun her around the kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "You see," Samuel said, setting her down gently, "I told you age was just a number. Our child will be lucky to have a mother with your wisdom and strength." Their daughter Mary Catherine was born in the spring of their third year of marriage. She was a healthy, beautiful baby, with Eleanor's brown hair and Samuel's gray eyes. Eleanor had never known it was possible to love someone so completely and instantly. When Mary was 2 years old, Eleanor had a son they named David, and 2 years after that, another daughter named Rose. Eleanor, who had been told she was too old to have children, found herself the mother of 3 healthy, happy babies. The children thrived on the ranch, growing up strong and capable under the vast Montana sky. They learned to ride horses before they could properly walk, and they helped with ranch work as soon as they were old enough. Eleanor loved watching Samuel with their children, seeing how gentle and patient he was with them. As the years passed, Eleanor became one of the most respected women in the territory. She organized the ladies' auxiliary at the church, started a lending library in town, and helped establish a school that served children from several surrounding ranches. People often came to Eleanor for advice, whether about raising children, managing households, or dealing with the challenges of frontier life. She had a way of listening without judging and offering practical wisdom that really helped. One day, when Eleanor was 40 years old and had been married for 8 years, a young woman approached her after church. The woman was clearly a mail-order bride, probably about 25 years old, and she looked nervous and uncertain. "Mrs. Crawford," the young woman said hesitantly, "my name is Alice Porter. I just arrived last week to marry Tom Wilson, and I am terrified that I have made a terrible mistake. Everyone says you were a mail-order bride too, and that you found happiness here. Could you give me some advice?" Eleanor smiled warmly at the young woman. "Of course, Alice. Why do not you come have tea with me tomorrow afternoon? We can talk about whatever is worrying you." Alice looked relieved. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford. Everyone speaks so highly of you. They say you are proof that a woman can find true love and happiness even when everyone expects her to fail." Eleanor felt a warm glow of pride. She thought about the scared, desperate woman she had been when she first arrived in Montana Territory. That woman would never have believed she could become someone that others looked up to and sought advice from. That evening, as Eleanor sat on the porch watching Samuel teach their children to rope fence posts, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had come to Montana expecting to settle for a marriage of convenience with a man who might not even truly want her. Instead, she had found a love deeper and more satisfying than anything she had ever imagined. She had found a place where her age and experience were valued rather than seen as liabilities. She had found a community that had learned to respect and appreciate her contributions,